Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Reash. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. And thank you for joining me for this conversation today. Before I introduce my guests, let me first thank you for joining wherever you are. This is the Society's first time on YouTube Live. So if there's a few technical difficulties, we appreciate your patience. But I do want to tell you that both myself and my guest, Matthew Goodwin, would like to hear questions and answer questions from you. And the best way to submit your question is to email questions@winstonchurchill.org. But don't worry, you don't have to remember that email address. It will be posted here on the YouTube channel shortly. So my guest today is Matthew Goodwin, who is professor of politics at the University of Kent and author of many books, including the one we are discussing today, titled Values, Voice, and Virtue, The New British Politics. Professor Goodwin, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me along, Justin. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So, Matt, your book has generated a significant amount of interest and conversation in the UK, at least from what I've seen. And I've seen you in a few disputes on Twitter, and instead of rehashing those and discussing those conversations, I just wanted to make a remark on just like this book touching a nerve. And if I can give the briefest of synopsis, your book is essentially trying to explain why there has been a populist political revolt against the political elites, specifically in the United Kingdom. So why do you think this book and this topic has generated so much conversation, and is it actually a product of what you describe in your book?
Yeah, I think it's a great starter question. I mean, obviously, you think about British politics, the common saying in Westminster is we're 5 years behind American politics in terms of seeing many of the same disputes and division over many of the same issues. The way that I think about the country, Justin, is I think we've had 10 years of unprecedented political turmoil. We've had three big public revolts in British politics. We've had the rise of populism with the figure of Nigel Farage, a close ally of Donald Trump. We've had the vote for Brexit, which obviously shocked the world. And then we had the post-Brexit realignment of British politics, which was led by Boris Johnson, somebody who obviously models himself or would like to think that he's in the Churchillian mold. And those three revolts really reshaped the country, reshaped the country's foreign policy, reshaped its economy, reshaped much of its domestic policy. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to really step back from them and say, well, what caused this? What led to this decade of turmoil and political churn? And my argument essentially is that what we've got in Britain, like I think what you've got in America in some respects, is a political media and cultural class that has steadily been losing touch with the values that are held by millions of voters, particularly working class, non-college educated voters. We've got the same groups that are dominating really the institutions and not giving voice to those groups in the national conversation. And then we're also steadily embracing this identity politics, this very divisive way of seeing the world, which is really focused on promoting people's identities as racial, ethnic, sexual, gender groups rather than individuals. And I think that's encouraging politicians to see different groups as having different moral value in society. And so what I'm really doing with this book, and why it's caused such a storm in Britain, is I'm really taking aim at that group. And I'm saying, look, if we want to avoid becoming America in terms of the polarization and the division, I think we really need to ask our ruling class to make some compromises, be more responsive to public opinion, and begin to better reflect the wider country. So that essentially is what the book's about.
So thinking of the three V's, values, virtue, and voice, can you briefly describe why you identified those three V's as the pillars, if you will, of this new sort of a division within politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, I'm a political scientist, I'm an academic. I think if you look at all the literature on why voters across not just Britain but the West have been abandoning the main parties, have been rebelling against the political establishment, cultural values are at the center of that. Lots of voters feel uncomfortable about issues like immigration, borders, how we think about national identity. Also how we think about issues like political correctness or woke type issues. And what we're seeing, I think, in France, in Italy, in Sweden, in Britain and elsewhere, is, I think, the rise of movements that are doing a better job of tapping into those concerns and grievances among voters. So, for example, if you want to understand why so many Brits voted for Brexit, really it came down to two issues. One was wanting decisions about the UK to be taken in the UK. As Churchill once said, we're not of Europe. We're with Europe. We're not of Europe. We do have a distinctive identity, history, and culture, and I think many voters would probably share that view. And secondly, they wanted the overall level of immigration into Britain to decline. And it was really those two motives over sovereignty and migration that led many people to vote for Brexit. And of course, those values were not really reflected or shared by much of the political and media class in Westminster. And when I talk about this notion of voice, I also talk about this idea that, whether you look at politics, whether you look at media, whether you look at the creative industries, cultural institutions, they are overwhelmingly dominated by Oxbridge, Oxford, Cambridge, elite university graduates who tend to lean left on cultural questions, tend to be very socially liberal, if not radically progressive, tend to live in the cities, university towns, and tend to really derive their status today from aligning themselves with this radical progressivism, with this kind of woke worldview that they view now as being integral to their social status. So, what I'm saying really in the book is, if you look at just the last 20 years in British politics, I think actually we've got a pretty big problem in that lots of voters have been really drifting away from the main parties on lots of these issues, both the left and the right, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Lots of voters drifting into apathy, saying they're not going to vote at all. Maybe they're going to vote for a populist or a new party. And if I'm being honest with you, Justin, I'm also one of the reasons I wrote this book is I'm concerned about the state of British politics. I think we're not a happy country. I think we're a fragmented country at the moment, with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England moving in different directions. And I think also the ruling class not being as in touch with the country as I'm arguing in this book it should be. And really, if anything, it's a rallying cry to say, can we try and close this gulf that's open between these two groups?
Well, so if I'm hearing you correctly, Matt, you're more concerned with groupthink over representation. Is that a fair assessment of your concerns? Representation in the sense of using your elected representative in a town, in a city, in a shire, whatever, to really represent those citizens and that electorate versus more of a party first point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think in more even I'd say more generally than that, I think what I'm pointing at is when we talk about diversity, when we talk about increasing representation in politics, we often, in Britain today, we really only talk about that in terms of race and gender. We don't really talk about that in terms of education, class, and values. So, you look at the political institutions, we really don't have that much intellectual or viewpoint diversity at all. In fact, most people in the House of Commons tend to come from the same backgrounds and hold the same values. And of course, that's a problem, I would argue. So I think, I would say really the point is trying to think about diversity in a much broader sense, and try to ask, why do we have so few voices from different political and social backgrounds in the system? Why do we have so few voices that are advocating different values in British politics? And that's really ultimately what the book's about.
So I was really struck by the amount of data you present in your book. Certainly well researched, well argued. Um, was there a significant assumption that you held before doing your research, or something that you thought you would find that was then significantly challenged, by the data?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I thought is that maybe things, I suppose I suspected that things were not quite as bad as maybe I feared they'd become. And I sort of thought I'd maybe overstated the case. But actually, when you look at the extent to which our political system has really excluded a large number of voters from the corridors of power, it's no longer really reflecting what many people want to see in British politics. I think probably a lot of Americans would see a lot of overlaps actually in this book. I was pretty surprised by by the extent to which my thesis was validated. I think if you also look at just how much American culture and American politics has sort of seeped into Britain, whether it's through corporations, whether it's through politics, whether it's through the celebrity class or whatever, we have really, I think, steadily imported American culture at quite a significant degree. And I think that is now reflected in many of the political debates that we're having over these culture war type issues. So, a couple of years ago, I remember an American pollster, Frank Luntz, came over to the UK and concluded that, the UK was not yet America. I'm sort of now thinking that actually the difference between them is becoming narrower by the day. We don't have your levels of polarization yet, but I would argue that we do have the basis for them in terms of these very distinctive political and social identities that people are taking on, partly shaped by Brexit, but also shaped by these issues that you're also grappling with, the issues of immigration, who we are, our history, our identity. And I think, these are things obviously we've debated throughout the 20th century, but today they're getting much greater salience. They've become much more important to voters. They've become more important to political parties. And I think, that explains really the dislocation that we've had in our politics over the last decade.
Can I ask on, your conclusions on the role of individual leadership? This being the International Churchill Society and the
Yeah.
National Churchill Leadership Center, taking this back a century, when specifically in the UK, you had numerous political parties.
Mm.
Had the Liberals, the Labor wasn't really, in being, but of course you had the Conservatives and you had others in it. And it seemed like that political leaders specifically at that time, were in the service of the public good in a different way that you would think politicians are now. And maybe that's recency bias, but it does seem like there are more career politicians, if you will, rather than public servants, akin to Winston Churchill. Do you have that? Is that a fair assessment?
I think in broad terms it is. I think if you look at some of the survey data that we've got, we've definitely seen an increase in the share of British voters who will say now that politicians are mainly in politics for themselves and are not in politics to serve the interests of the country. 1945, 1950, you had more of that. But I think a lot of other things have changed too. I mean, for example, you go back to Churchill's time, there was a prominent working class elite in politics. There were
Yes.
trade unionists, there were non-graduates, there was a diversity of views in the House of Commons. I mean, certainly there were lots of elites. I mean, Churchill was a great example of that. Clement Attlee, to some extent as well. Great friends, great rivals, obviously. But more generally, I think there was a plurality of views in the House of Commons when it came to class. Not so much, when it came to men and women. Women were almost completely absent in the House of Commons, but there was a working class elite in British politics. And I think basically what's happened since then is that range of voices has narrowed. Trade unions have become weaker. Local regional media has become weaker. The ladders into politics and the corridors of power have steadily broken down. The graduate class has basically taken over. So in my discipline of political science, we now talk about the rise of so-called diploma democracies that are now dominated by, mainly elite graduates from Oxbridge or Russell Group institutions, or what you might call Ivy League institutions. And I think alongside that, we've also seen, media, creative industries, cultural institutions, the civil service, films, television, publishing also increasingly be dominated by graduates from elite universities. And I do think partly, if you want to really make sense of the populist rebellions in British politics, you've got to really make sense of that. And what I talk about in the book is a sort of a lost notion of voice, that many people just feel that they're not in this national conversation anymore. Their values are not reflected back at them in the adverts they watch on television or the commercials. They're not reflected back in the movies they watch, in the books, in the bestseller lists, in the debates in the House of Commons or on the BBC. And I think there are lots of voters that are feeling that they're excluded. Now, of course, America is different in that respect. You've got this kind of polarized media, you've got a polarized education system, you've got new universities that are setting up to represent different viewpoints and so on. I think Britain, in some respects, is quite different. I don't think Britain has that full diversity of viewpoints that America does. And I think that's why lots of people have felt that they're shut out from the conversation.
You brought up a very astute point regarding media, but specifically local media. Here in the United States, pretty much local media is either the outlets are either owned by national media companies or just simply don't exist. And I know that to be true also in the United Kingdom. And, I thought it was so fascinating you discussing, so let me ask you, what role did local media play in representing and giving the voice to communities that, are simply not on the mainstream's radar?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, Winston Churchill was a journalist, wrote lots of articles. That essentially is partly how he made his money at a certain point in his life. If you go back and you read some of the books by, very influential journalists, you read My Trade by Andrew Marr, among others, they did talk about, fairly ordinary people coming into journalism that had passed through the local gazette, the regional newspaper, and had then gone down to Westminster or London Fleet Street and had, started working for the national papers. And they'd often not passed through the universities. They were often, old school journalists with a strong understanding of the communities that they came from. I think where we are now, and I've just finished reading a book in America, by an American author called Bad News, which is about the transformation of US media. And I think, she makes a very similar point, which is that actually increasingly over the last 20 years, rather than have that kind of local, provincial or regional media provide a sort of buffer to what you might call the elite, what we've had now is a kind of narrowing of the range of voices within media. We've had, most young journalists now go straight from Oxford or Cambridge into the newsroom. They often don't really have many strong connections to particular local communities. They don't really have much experience outside of that media room, and often view themselves more as activists than independent, objective journalists. And I think this is a real problem in media more generally, and it's no coincidence that levels of trust in media have also been falling over the last 10, 15 years. So I think the collapse of that intermediary buffer really matters. I think obviously the changing business model in media, the rise of social media, clickbait, the need for newspapers and television channels to get clicks has also kind of driven this. And we're in a position now where, as you mentioned earlier on before we came on this call, Justin, that you've been to London recently, you probably noticed that we've become a very anti-intellectual society. There is might be maybe too a sweeping statement, but there are no interesting intellectual discussions and debates in British politics and British society, really. We're not like the French or the Germans. We don't really have extended, interesting conversations about public policy challenges and where we're going as a society. It's all very short and reactive, and the news cycle is incredibly narrow in its focus. And I think that's really part of the problem, if I'm honest with you. I think we're not really interrogating the state of our society to the full extent that we should be. And that, again, you know, partly is what I talk about in the book, is saying, well, you know, if you really want to think about how do we close this polarization and division, one thing we could think about doing is getting a much wider range of voices into our national media, and getting a much wider range of voices into our politics, into the creative industries, the cultural institutions, and so on. And if we did that, I think, you know, it would be a good start, although I'm not holding my breath.
Do you think that, you know, one of the questions I wrote here is, what role does social media play in this revolt? And, you know, I'm always nervous to talk about the actual impact of social media. I'm sure as a data researcher, you've seen the, you know, the actual data that something like 3% of Twitter, you know, accounts are actually active on Twitter, and 1% of those, you know, produce 80% of the tweets or something like that per day.
Yeah.
So it seems very skewed, but it does have an outsized influence. And I wonder, you know, how insidious is social media to this sense of us versus them?
Well, obviously, social media, I think, is probably an accelerator of some of that. I think if you look at the evidence on the role of social media in polarization, I'm pretty won over by the suggestion that it's contributing, certainly. But I was also influenced by the exchange between some academics and researchers at Facebook. And on the one hand, the academics were saying, look, social media is driving polarization. And on the other hand, Facebook researchers were pulling together a lot of evidence and saying, well, political polarization began long before we had social media. You know, really, you can trace it in America to 1980s, in Britain, you know, a little bit later, but certainly before we were all on Twitter and Facebook. And I think if you look at, you know, key rebellions that we've had in this country, and I think probably Americans would maybe connect with this, you know, in the aftermath of the Brexit rebellion, people were looking for very simplistic, easy explanations for why so many voters had rebelled against the establishment. And the instinctive reaction was to say, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's shady big tech companies that have been misleading and manipulating voters. But ever since those initial narratives have come out, those initial arguments, you know, the evidence really has pointed elsewhere. And it's, you know, it's shown pretty consistently, for example, that the Brits are among the least trusting of social media in the Western world. Most of the people who have voted for these anti-system movements are not usually active on social media. They certainly don't view it as a reliable source of information. So I'm not denying for a second that it might have exacerbated social tensions, but the idea that it's a causal driver, I think is misleading, to say the least. And you know, if you think about going back to Churchill for a minute, if you think of fundamentally what was at the root of Brexit, you know, ultimately it was Britain's status as being an awkward partner with the European community and the European Union. I mean, going back to the late 1940s, early 1950s, many British elites, you know, certainly some pushed for European integration, but many felt that geographically, culturally, politically, diplomatically, Britain was distinctive from Europe, that it was outward looking, it was a maritime nation, it had a very different history, it's the foundation of its national identity was completely different. You know, the Brits didn't really have any need to feel ashamed or embarrassed about their national identity after the Second World War. They were a maritime nation trading with many other parts of the world that had been shaped partly by empire, and then over time, you know, I think that sort of seeped into the British consciousness and how people began to think about the European Union and began to think about European integration. And as you went into the 1990s, you went into the ERM crisis, then later went into the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. The idea that this was a secure, safe, and prosperous club, you know, was really, increasingly undermined by the reality of membership. The refugee crisis in 2014, 2015, in many respects continues today, I think has also underlined this fact that for many Brits, this is not an organization that was bringing them that sense of security. So, the roots of Brexit, what I'm trying to say, go back much further than social media. Certainly were a long time coming. And I don't think for that reason we'll be rejoining the club anytime soon.
May I ask a question about your research and if something came up through it? Was there a way to gauge the respondents' point of view on the accountability of political leaders? And you think of what the reason I thought of this was the 350 million pound money back to the NHS, on that during that campaign, and I wonder if part of their if part of the revolt and their untrusting or distrust, excuse me, of political leaders is based on these campaign promises or what have you, and that there's zero accountability for these things not happening or happening. Did that come across at all in the research? Is that easy to measure?
I mean, I think when I hear the word accountability and also representation, I think basically that's one of the reasons why we ended up leaving the European Union to begin with. I think many voters felt that it wasn't sufficiently accountable, it wasn't sufficiently transparent, and it wasn't sufficiently democratic. And I think, they had some good reasons to think that way. I think if you look at the European Union, it certainly has elections every 5 years. It gives people representation in the European Parliament, but it is not substantively democratic. Voters cannot have any meaningful influence over the exchange of executive office, right? So that's why people had a problem with the European Union politically. In the aftermath of Brexit, did they get accountability? Well, look, one of the arguments is, yeah, they did. If you look at Boris Johnson's behavior during Partygate and COVID, he was removed by his party. If you look at Liz Truss, her handling of the economy and inflation, she was essentially removed. And as we go from general election to general election from here on, people will be able to exert a degree of influence over politics, a degree of accountability that they simply would never have been able to exert while we were in the European Union. And so, the issue, Justin, I think since Brexit is the whole debate has been framed along the lines of the economy. And, is this in Britain's economic self-interest? And obviously there are a lot of people lined up to make the argument that Britain has harmed its economic self-interest by leaving the European Union, right? And there are lots of people that can sympathize with that argument. But my reply to that would be, if you look at what voters wanted through Brexit, it wasn't really ever about the economy. It was a notion of reclaiming democratic power and reclaiming sovereignty and reclaiming the notion that we can be a self-governing nation state again. So economic self-interest doesn't really capture that. So I think looking at where we are going forward, obviously that raises a whole host of questions around whether the country's political class can reposition Britain so that it is an effective, vibrant, prosperous democracy, national democracy, out of the European Union, forging new relationships with other powers around the world, whether they can make people feel as though the laws that are being passed in Westminster are reflective of public opinion and are making taking full advantage of the divergence that the country now has from the European Union. We're beginning to see that with the City of London. We're beginning to see that with financial regulation. We're beginning to see that with trade deals with parts of Asia and elsewhere. And also, I think they're going to be asking themselves, do they now have a greater sense of efficacy that they can make have a difference over the decisions that affect their daily lives? And while we're in the European Union, Justin, and I went out on a limb as an academic, and I never campaigned for Brexit, but in the aftermath of the referendum, I did say that I felt that vote should be implemented. I felt that for the purpose of democracy, for the sake of British democracy, we should respect and uphold and implement that decision, which put me, on the opposite side of 90% of my academic colleagues. But the reason I felt that way was because of these issues around democracy and accountability that ultimately I think it was more important to see it through, essentially, and it would have been a lot riskier not to do that. I think had we not pursued Brexit after that referendum, I think we would have seen an explosion of populism, division, rancor, and a very ugly politics.
Well, if I can ask your let me ask about one part of your book, the values part, coming in a real life example. Of course, you provide real life examples, but a recent example of that coming into conflict with the very unique British system of governance with its union of devolution. So, as you know, two months ago now, a month and a half ago, the Scottish Parliament, or excuse me, whatever the term is, Scottish government passed gender self-ID, which was then, for the first time, I believe, in the history of the Union, struck down, for lack of a better word, by the government in Westminster. Is this a prime example of values coming into conflict with governance? And what's your take on that? And I'm not meaning to provide a judgment on either side of if you think it's right or wrong, but it is a very interesting political development.
Well, it was very interesting in the sense that we had the Scottish National Party, which is a very progressive party on cultural issues, pursue a law that would have allowed 16-year-olds to legally change their gender without any medical supervision or advice. And when you really ask Scots how they felt about that issue, and I did at the time because I do quite a lot of polling, only about 20% of Scots really supported that, about 80% opposed it. And I think really this is an example of this divide that I'm talking about between a new elite, a sort of new elite graduate class that tend to lean very left on culture and identity, and a much larger number of voters who are often looking at the decisions that are being made around identity, gender, history, culture, and are really either not recognizing those decisions or certainly not liking those decisions that are being made. And I think Scotland was a good example of that. I mean, it was interesting at the same time that Winston Churchill's party, the Conservatives, opposed that piece of legislation because they were trying to uphold the equalities legislation that been brought in by the new Labour government. So the argument against the Scottish National Party was not that it was pursuing a policy that was not conservative, that was radically progressive. The case against the SNP was that if it had succeeded with that legislation, then that would have contradicted equalities legislation in other parts of the UK. So the Conservatives were actually leaning on the Labour Party, New Labour's Tony Blair's legislation to oppose what was happening in Scotland. And this is partly why I think a lot of Conservative voters in the UK are beginning to ask themselves the question as to whether the Conservative Party is what its name implies. And I think there is a considerable degree of unrest and disillusionment in the country about whether the Conservative Party is still a conservative party. And obviously in the US, your debate is much more, is much further ahead than ours. The Republicans are being kind of reshaped in the post-Trump era. You're sort of seeing Republicans move in a different direction in their relationship with the state, in their relationship with culture war type questions, CRT schools, and so on. I think the British Tories are way behind on a lot of those issues, and I think you can see that partly reflected in the Scotland debate.
So there's a question submitted via the email, and it's about the SNP, and we talked a little bit about, obviously, specifically about this gender ID law, but they're asking, is the SNP one of the major products of British realignments, and is that the same with those parties in Wales, the National Party in Wales, and how do those, do you think, fit into this conversation? I mean, those are they not populist by definition?
Well, there's certainly a case to be made that Nicola Sturgeon was more than happy to press a few populist buttons every now and then. And if anything, what's happening in Scotland at the moment with the allegations of corruption and financial impropriety certainly would suggest that she's indulging in a little bit of populist behavior, shall we say. I think, in some respects, what we're seeing, obviously, is a fragmenting United Kingdom, is a weakening UK, a weakening union, as essentially, and I'm painting some very broad strokes here, there are obviously some outliers and exceptions, but Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland to some extent, are gradually moving away from non-London England in the value sets that are driving those areas. So I think you can see that most visibly in Scotland, where essentially Scotland has come to sort of embrace a kind of pro-European liberal progressive outlook, partly in response to Brexit and Boris Johnson and things that we've seen in Westminster. And that trend was already underway prior to the Brexit referendum, but it's certainly been exacerbated by it. So, the question remains: how can you hold the union together? And I think the current, as we're talking now in sort of mid-April, early mid-April 2023, I do think that the current implosion of the Scottish National Party, the internal difficulties that it's experiencing, the fact that many voters in Scotland feel that the SNP has been too obsessed with independence and it hasn't dealt with the very real issues that are pressing in Scotland, with healthcare, education, cost of living, and so on. I think probably that will give the union a few years, of respite, will give the union a few years of relief where it can gather itself. But these issues are not going away. I mean, how can the UK endure as a multinational state in an increasingly diverse, non-European, global society? I think is the $1 million question, and it's going to be a difficult one to answer, whoever leads the country.
So quite a few questions have come through regarding the role of the king. I'll try to summarize all three because they're kind of the same. But basically, what do you think the role of the monarchy is in terms of attempting to bridge this divide? And do you think it's possible in that sense for the monarchy to retain its removed status above politics, if you will, in present day?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, historically, the monarchy has always provided stability and continuity. That's essentially the kind of function of the monarchy. So continuity in a changing world, stability in a world in flux. And I think the Elizabeth II, the late Queen Elizabeth II, was the sort of, the real example of that. And I think probably, if you look at the recent debates that we've been having in British politics around issues to do with diversity, racism, the legacy of history, empire, Commonwealth, the royal family has found itself at the very forefront of that and has really been struggling, I think it's fair to say, to find or to carve out an avenue or a path forward that will allow it to respond to that in a meaningful, sustainable way, right? I mean, it's got to take the whole country with it. It can't just lean into one side of what you might call the culture war. So you're seeing through King Charles III, through William and Catherine, to some extent through Harry and Meghan, albeit in maybe not a more successful way, you're seeing an attempt to try and reshape the monarchy around Britain in the early 2020s and the early 21st century. And I think it's fair to say, the consensus in Westminster and London is that nobody's quite figured out what that role is going to be and what it's going to look like. The only thing that I think people really accept is that in some shape or form, the monarchy will change. I mean, it will either, slim down and it will be more sort of, flexible, responsive, maybe a little bit less pomp and circumstance, a little bit more, what you might call social activism, a little bit more intervention on some issues, perhaps. And it will certainly, I think, be very conscious of the fact that, you know, as an institution, it's going to be all too easy to get dragged into many of these contentious debates. Now, if I look at the polling on the royal family, which I do fairly regularly, you know, my conclusion to, you know, the royal family's press team would be it's still an incredibly popular institution. In the aftermath of what we might call Megxit, Harry and Meghan's departure, you know, Will and Catherine's popularity has gone up. Prince Charles is very popular. He's adapted to the new role. Camilla is seen much more favorably than she was in the 1990s and the 2000s. So, you know, in terms of numbers and data, I would say things are looking okay for the royal family. But there are some enormous challenges for King Charles that I think, you know, are pretty obvious to everybody, and he's going to have to tread delicately while dealing with them. Sorry, Justin, I can't quite hear you there.
I was on mute. So in your book, you allow me to quote, you state, quote, politics, in short, has moved from the old transactional debates about what we have to the far more existential debates about who we are. Now, that's a very macro statement, and I appreciate in your introduction you talk about in terms of data researchers, you could be a micro or a macro, and you certainly fall into the macro. But what is, you know, if you can pinpoint it, and maybe you can't, but what are the one or two drivers of that transition? Is it the abundance of relative abundance of opportunity and privilege in Western democracies that allow these democracies to actually start thinking about existential versus how do we create, you know, a living standard for most of our people? You know, where would you say are the two major drivers?
In terms of this shift into sort
from
of
transactional debates to existential.
Well, to be honest with you, Justin, what I argue in the book is that essentially Britain has gone through a political revolution from the late 1970s until today. Now, you know, most people won't think of it as a revolution. They'll think of it as different prime ministers. But what I argue essentially is that we've had these two transformative leaders in Margaret Thatcher on the one hand and Tony Blair on the other. And essentially, you know, they were very different politicians. They came from very different backgrounds. But what they did between them is really put into place what I call this liberal consensus. Margaret Thatcher injected the country with a very radical dose of economic liberalism, you know, deregulating finance, liberalizing the economy, integrating it into you know, globalization. And Tony Blair followed that up with a radical dose of cultural liberalism that was chiefly oriented around large-scale migration and an economy that was even more tightly wrapped around London, the service sector, and that was dependent upon ongoing migration in order to feed consumption. And that basically is what led to, you know, this model of this liberal consensus that I talk about in the book. And, you know, that worked well for lots of people. I mean, it worked well for, you know, elite graduates, middle-class professionals, Londoners, people in the city. You know, it worked really well for those groups. It worked less well for many other people. And that's really what I talked about in the book, and said that, you know, if you look at non-London England, if you look at working class, non-college educated voters, older voters, you know, they really looked at this revolution with a growing sense of alarm. And by the time that we got to the 2010s, this had really kind of galvanized these cultural issues in British politics. So, you know, immigration became one of the top issues in the country. People began to get concerned about whether people were really listening to their voice in politics and the institutions. You know, they began to get very concerned about the pace of social and cultural change. They began to get anxious about how we were thinking about Britishness. You know, is our national identity just about a celebration of diversity, or is it actually about celebrating a distinctive history, a distinctive identity, a distinctive culture? And of course, you know, many voters feel that because of the legacy of history and because of things, you know, to do with Churchill and the Second World War and else and so on, that there is something unique and special about the country. There is something that goes back a long way that should be celebrated. And maybe they don't share this view that actually the only celebration of Britishness should really be a celebration of diversity. I think there's nothing wrong in saying a country is welcoming of others. I think, it's a great thing, but it can't be the basis of a national identity, because then it's like saying the country has no identity of its own. And I think many voters probably feel that way, and and that's partly what's been driving the concern that we've seen. So, this is really why I talk about politics as moving away from kind of the old left-right economic debates over redistribution into this new era where really we're debating now, like you are in America, who are we? I mean, who are we in a rapidly diversifying, rapidly globalizing society and economy? What are the shared values that hold us together? What are the shared traditions and culture, ways of life that hold us together? How are we going to bridge, this polarization? How are we going to hold different groups together over the long term? What is this experiment? How is this experiment going to work? And I think that debate is one that many of our leaders have been reluctant to get into.
I was just going to say, yeah,
because it is so big and it's complex. But I think it is a debate that's not really going anywhere. I mean, if you compare British society to Churchill's time, I mean, would he recognize British society today? I think is an interesting question. I think, it is radically different. I think he'd immediately spot the challenges and the tensions that would need to be overcome.
Yeah, Matt, a few more questions, and I'm conscious of your time, and I appreciate what I appreciate about your book is that your data is, like most data, even though data can be manipulated, but the data is, it's nonpartisan, and it's really speaking on behalf of groups that you could, not say where they're from, you could not say how old they are, you could not say if they're men or women and what religion they are. And but the crux of the matter comes out. Do you find that in your promotion of the book and your work as a as a political researcher and professor, you just talked about the reluctance to have what you think is what you argue is a very important debate. Do you think that's why do you think there is a reluctance? Why is there a reluctance for you in the public sphere to debate with people in various forums about your arguments?
I think there is definitely a willingness to have a limited discussion about these issues. I think, looking at the last couple of weeks since the book came out, certainly, the BBC and some of our main channels are at least, willing to have a limited discussion about these issues. But I think when you look at some of the specific groups that I'm talking about in this book, so what I call radical progressives, very left-leaning, very often privileged, elite graduates who sort of push a very particular view of the world. You might relate to that if you look at some of the politicians in your politics, the sort of AOC view of the world. When I've suggested that, I'd love to debate that side of the debate, there's often been complete silence or rejection. And really, when you look at progressives and the sort of what I call the new elite, the cultural elite, what you often find in the evidence is that they are the most likely to unfriend, block, and distance themselves from people who hold different political beliefs to their own. And that certainly is shown in the data, in the evidence, and that's certainly something that I talk about in the book. So that's been a frustration because I really, Justin, want to have that conversation with that side of the debate and say, you have to accept that the way you see the country, the way you see the world is not really the way everybody sees it, and it is a very, at times it can be a very dogmatic way of seeing the world. It can be a very emotional and polarizing way of seeing the world. And it's been frustrating not being able to have some of those discussions. I mean, the book itself has gone into number 2 in the bestseller list. So, the argument that, it's not a relevant text or whatever is not really valid. But I've certainly encountered this reluctance to engage with the substantive argument that I'm presenting, and that I think that's a shame, actually.
From your research, what strikes me, I think, in terms when you talk about, a distinctive identity, and I mean, to your point, I completely agree with you. I think somebody of Churchill's time wouldn't recognize the UK, wouldn't recognize the United States, wouldn't recognize the globe in so many ways, whether that's geopolitical changes or rise of certain countries and in their sort of governance of their people, namely China. Um, what do you think? Is Britain, because it's a secular society? I've done a lot of research, or I've seen a lot of research on the decline of church going, if you will.
Yeah.
And how do you think that sort of sense of a secular society, which it is in the United States as well, do you think that has added to the division of the elites versus everyone else, and or what role do you give religion in this argument?
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, I talk in one of the chapters about the decline of Christianity in British society and the rapid decline in the share of people who identify as Christian. And if you look, for example, at Gen Z, people who were born after 2004, about 1% of that group identify with the Church of England. So there is a.
What did you say? 1%?
Yeah, 1% identify with
That's
the Church
incredible.
of
My
England. So
goodness.
you've seen this remarkable collapse in affiliation, and I think into that void, the kind of collapse of robust ideologies, the collapse of religion, the collapse of class, to some extent, I think has stepped into what has stepped into that is this new kind of ideology of whatever your favorite term is, radical progressivism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, but this sort of performative victimhood, this sense of moral righteousness that comes now from really embracing a new identity politics. And I think that's a very unfortunate place for Britain to be. I mean, if you go back to Churchill's time, and as we were discussing before we started filming, what was it that defined British political culture in Churchill's time? Well, one of the arguments was that it was a civic culture, that the Brits were deferential. They emphasized consensus, they emphasized compromise, moderation. They stressed the need to respect institutions, and they didn't really like politicians intervening in their lives. But it was essentially, a big political culture that emphasized many things that were absent in France and Italy and Germany. I mean, the Brits didn't do messianic, emotional, polarizing tribal politics in a way that the French and the Italians and the Germans and others did. What worries me about where we are today is that civic culture is increasingly hard to find, because I think whether it's from the kind of cultural left or the populist right, that civic culture is increasingly under strain, which isn't a good place, I think, for any society to be.
Yeah. And my last comment is, I know I've noted that the decline of whether it be the community center or the public library, at least here in the United States, has added to the sense of hollowness, to the sense of, kind of isolation. And, as Great Britain, there are places in Great Britain that are incredibly remote, incredibly isolated.
Absolutely.
And I would think that sense of isolation will probably add to the division. Would you agree with that?
Well, we certainly have geographical division like you do. I mean, we certainly have a growing divide between the cities and the small towns and the countryside. Absolutely. So without question. And that's partly compounding many of the divides that I'm talking about, divides over education, divides over generation as well. So, in that sense, we're similar to America. I think we're a few miles behind America, but unfortunately, I do think we're on the same road as America. And I think, it is only a matter of time until that polarization that we're beginning to see now seep into the system becomes much more visible.
Matt, thank you for your time. If you are
Thank you
interested
for
in buying
having me.
that book, we have a link on our YouTube page. Take care, Matt, and thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Take care.